Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon, and today we're looking at the top 10 decks for Sao Paulo, the International Championships that's coming around just a week and a half away now actually, and I'm going to be attending and I'm very excited to be there. We're going to be looking at the best decks in the format right now for this tournament, looking back at a few previous results to plan out the top 10 list. There's a bit of opinion in there as well from me. But really, the top 10 has been made via the performances of late. And we're going to be going over a few tech options and also looking at their favourable and unfavourable matchups. And the best way that I like to see the build be played right now, with a little bit of theory thrown in there as well. So, let's get straight into it. With number 10, we have Mega Gardevoir EX. There are still the two ways that you try to build this deck. There's first of all the Gardevoir Xerneas, which plays both Mega Evolutions and tries to swarm a load of energy on the board and start going into these one-hit KOs with Brilliant Arrow. And then there's the straight Mega Gardevoir build, which is just a spare ray, using lots of Hoopers, Shamans, and Dragonite to respam them all. My favourite list right now is actually the split Mega build, using the Primal Clash Gardevoir EX, mainly because you can abuse Fairy Garden, which is a really powerful stadium card for you, which also helps out against the Decidueye matchup because you don't have any stall targets because everything can move quite freely. Also, the fact that you have Xerneas really helps out against a few of the energy denial decks like Lapras, because simply Geomancy gets you a lot of energy onto the board quite quickly, and you have things like Mega Turbo to recycle it anyway. You'd never really lose your board state against those sorts of decks. So right now I feel like that's the best build, although you still can go for the Steam Siege if you wish. I've seen a few of the Steam Siege builds do okay. I think some of them have been running even 3 Hexmaniac at times. You can see in the hot techs, I'm a big fan of at least 2 Hexmaniac in either of these builds. It improves your Volcanium and it improves your Decidueye matchup, which are both really important matchups to cover right now. I would also advise Double Hooper. Even if you're playing the split Mega build, I found Double Hooper to be absolutely phenomenal. I've recently made a video about the split Mega Gardevoir on the channel, so if you've not seen that, you can check out my list and see how that runs. Be sure to do that. In terms of unfavourables, Mega Rayquaza and Rainbow Force are like some of the most difficult ones. They're really challenging because they can one-hit KO you without you really having a response a lot of the time. And really the only win condition is to find early hexes and chain hex against the Ray while you try and build the board, but it's very, very unfavourable for you. That's sort of why it's only in at number 10 in a way. It does have some fairly awkward matchups, not just Ray and Gyarados, but Ray's one of the reasons why personally I've not been playing it much, because Mega Rayquaza has actually been tearing up the League Cups here in the UK. It's won like 3 or 4 I think. So that's one reason why I'm personally not a huge fan of Guardy right now, but looking at its recent performances, it's really underwhelmed. In Melbourne, only 3 in the top 32, and Malmo, I only have the top 8 results for Malmo. I've not been able to gather the resources for the top 32, but for Utah as well, it didn't feature at all in the top 32, so it's not been performing too great right now. It's a deck that's kind of reliant on the metagame. It does prefer dealing with lots of dark decks, like Yveltal and Turbo Darkrai. We know Turbo Darkrai is going to be popular, but it's still quite an open and wide format right now, so there's a few issues for Mega Gardy, and that's why it's placed itself only at number 10 right now. In at number 9, we have the Brave Man's Play. This is going to be Gyarados. If you can dodge enough Decidueye Plume day 1, this deck can really cause a lot of issues simply because you hit so hard. Obviously, Decidueye Plume is like the absolute auto loss. Beyond that, I would say that Espeon Wobbuffet or Espeon even splashed into Mewtwo can be awkward for the Gyarados players. And even Umbreon to an extent is awkward for you because they have sniping and they have energy denial and lots of other annoying tools at their disposal. But outside of that, Gyarados has a long list of good matchups, and we've seen already that in Sheffield it came second. It's continued to cut, as you can see, 1 top 32 in Melbourne. And looking at the top cut of Melbourne, there were so many Decidueye Vileplumes. You could tell that guy was going to have a bad day too, but nevertheless, they made it there. No top 8s in Malmo, but it did make, once again, a top 32 in Utah. So it's been performing. It's been getting enough wins under its belt and dodging enough Decidueye Plume. I think if you're expecting no more than 10% Decidueye, it could be a really strong play for you. You obviously have a fantastic Volcanion. You're pretty good against most EX decks simply because you can get the one-hit KO. My hot tech would be Professor Kukui right now so that you can one-hit KO fighting Fury Belted Darkrai. With 3 Magikarp on the bench, you can Kukui to get yourself over that 220 HP barrier. And beyond that, it's just the simple things of Gyarados. We've already exposed a very good list. Medi Haffy's second place Sheffield list. I would just completely net deck that. It's pretty perfect in my idea, in my mind. So yeah, the list is out there. It's pretty easy to build, fairly easy to pilot. And if you're feeling risky and there won't be much Decidueye, it could be a good play. So yeah, in at number 9 just because of its recklessness, but I wouldn't be surprised if I saw a few wandering around the tables. In at number 8 we have Eeveelutions. I've kind of cheated a bit because the Eeveelutions is such an open statement really. I myself have been testing a lot of Espeon Wobbuffet. I took it to a League Cup recently and had some fun with it. And there's also Umbreon Hammers, and there's also Umbreon Stage 1s, which is actually the one deck that made top 32. It was Umbreon, Eeveelutions plus Zoroark in at Melbourne. It made a second place at Malmo. Again, this is me kind of cheating because it was an Espeon plus Decidueye. And in Utah, one made top 32 as well. I believe that was an Umbreon list. So I really just cast a wide net to get some results in here for these decks to really justify me being able to talk about them, because they're a couple of pet decks of mine which I've really enjoyed right now. I think these are some of the best placed decks in the format, to be honest. I think Espeon Wobbuffet on paper is incredibly powerful. Has an insta-win Mewtwo, insta-win Gyarados, a very strong Volcanion if you're playing Vaporeon. It has a very strong Decidueye Vileplume. Has lots of big ticks towards itself that are really good matchups to have right now. Similarly, Umbreon has quite good matchups. You're favoured against Turbo Darkrai in my opinion. Again, with Wobbuffets, you're okay against Decidueye. The Volcanion's somewhat of an issue. You're less focused on Wobbuffet than the Espeon would be. But again, with Vaporeon, I feel like you have lots of good matchups. A few issues are just the consistency issues, for one thing. Additionally, the decks are quite weak to Energy Denial, so coming up against the Quad Lapras deck would be quite unfortunate for these Stage 1s. And also Mega Gardevoir is still an issue. They can carve through your Espeons via weakness, and your Umbreon's output is just absolutely shoddy against them, because you're doing 90-30 snipes in the first place, but they never give you easy prizes like Shamans because they're Despair Raying them off the board. And at the same time, they have resistance to you, so your 90 damage starts looking even grimmer, and you're having to, 3-shot them, which is very sad for you. So, I think if you're concerned that there will still be Guardia around, and the new budding hot deck right now is being Lapras, is kind of concerning for the Eeveelution builds, but I do think these decks have some very good matchups, and when built correctly, can be threatening in the format for sure. Couple of hot techs for me. I think you have to play Vaporeon. Just shore up the Volk matchup as best you can. Espeon Wob is already okay against it without the Vaporeon, but I feel like you just need to easy mode that deck, because you need to secure your Volk, because it will be a very popular deck in Brazil. I've had a few friends of mine and other people speculating about the metagame for Brazil, and the overwhelming consensus is that there is going to be a lot of Volcanion, so being able to have the instant tech to just one-hit through these guys is going to be important for you. I also think EXP shares a really good card in both Umbreon and Espeon builds. Even if it is just a 1 or 2 count, it can be really nice for retaining energy and making sure that you continue with viable attackers throughout the game. So those would be my hot techs. I do think on their own, they're like tier 2 decks at best, but the format is going towards them, really. It's really favouring them in terms of how many decent matchups these guys can pick up, mainly because they can jam in the Wobbuffet and it actually makes sense to play the Wob, unlike some other decks which are just sort of throwing it in for the sake of having a slightly better Decidueye. Here the synergy is actually there. You can strafe into it, or you can use it as an actual attacker if it's the Espeon deck, because you're playing elixirs and such anyway. So two decks that I'm a big fan of, only in at number 8 because of their recent performances being fairly under par. I think the decks aren't being played too much in the first place, definitely not by the top players, but there's been a few articles out there now. I know Someone's PC have done a few things on both Umbreon and Espeon, so there's some content out there. There's some good lists rattling around. We've profiled again Espeon not too long ago, so it's one to explore definitely, and I think it's one to keep your eye out for. In at number 7 we have Mega Rayquaza. Mega Ray has pretty much not changed for a long time. Its recent performances, no show in Melbourne, but in Malmo it did make one top 8, and in Utah 2 made top 32. It's just a deck with lots of raw power and speed. I think right now for hot techs, I would be playing the Manaphy Water build of Mega Rayquaza. Again, this is the concern for Decidueye Vileplume, so that you can be less often stuck in the active. Whenever I was watching the stream in Sheffield, the way that Rayquaza would lose the game against Decidueye is by getting a Hooper or a Dragonite dragged up to the active and stuck there for a few turns while the Decidueye player just racks up damage. So being able to have Manaphy gives you like 3 or 4 extra outs to move your attacker or your stall target from the opponent, and you can get back into Rayquaza and start hitting them all over again. In terms of unfavourable, I would say Yveltal Garb is one of the more awkward ones because they're guaranteed to be playing to Parallel really. And I would say Eeveelutions are also awkward. Some of them will be playing Jolteon, Umbreon plays lots of Hammers and Parallels, and Espeon plays like heavy Wobbuffets and some other disruption cards. I know my list at the very least would play Jolteon as well, so a couple of awkward matchups, but really it's just a powerhouse. I think it's favoured against things like Turbo Darkrai and Volcanium, which is very appealing, and if you play the Manaphy build, I think you're pretty okay against the Decidueye Plume. Obviously it bears down to who can go first and how well the turn 1 player gets set up. It's not too frequent that Decidueye Plume does actually get the turn 1. It's less than 50% from my own dummy hands and experience. So Rayquaza normally has a chance to get that turn 1 setup going, and once it does get that dominant board position, it can just run through pretty much anything. Again, my advice would be to play at least 2 Hex Maniac as well. I've seen very heavy Hex Rays right now. It's just going to really help you out against the Decidueye Plume, as I say, and it's going to help out against Volk just to have it at the right turns. Nonetheless, just to say that you have so much cycle in your deck with Double Hooper for Shaman that you can just dig and try and find Hex turn 1 and disrupt pretty much any deck. Things like Turbo Dark really don't appreciate it, even Yveltal to some extent, because even they are starting to play Hooper now sometimes after Azul has popularized a pretty good list. So, yeah, Mega Ray at number 7, solid contender. I think it's one to watch out for as always because it can just steamroll through lots of different decks right now. In at number 6, we have Yveltal Garbodor. I've just discussed it. It's a very strong deck right now. I think we've seen, again, a lack of performance for the deck. Don't know if it's just been piloted a lot less. I think a lot of people who would be playing Yveltal just shifted over to Turbo Darkrai a lot of the time. As you can see in Melbourne, 2 top 32s and just 1 top 32 in Utah. Again, it seems to be a deck that's not performing to its full potential because I still feel this deck is one of the strongest and one of the safest plays to pick right now. There's like no lightning in the format. Everyone's given up on things like Zeb Striker because Yveltal's, you know, not as popular as it used to be. Garbodor still covers a huge amount. I think Yveltal Garb is favoured against Volcanium, which again is a big deal. Decidueye Vileplume is awkward. I think if I'm going to be playing Yveltal Garb, I would play a 2-1 Garbodor and 1 Hex Maniac to try and re-establish the Garbodor even if we're going second, and also re-establish Floatstones if we have been hit with Beedrill. Nonetheless, it's still awkward playing the Garbodor against Decidueye Plume. You have to really play it smart. Sometimes you have to parallel your own Garbodor off the board just to stop it being a Lysander target later on. But that's all intricacies with the deck. I think Yveltal has the tools to come up against pretty much everything. It's been teched out a little bit recently with like Non-EX Mewtwo for the Mega matchup. It's also playing things like Hooper EX, which is actually something that I would advise. Seeing Azul's list was really cool. It's pretty much taking the Turbo Darkrai engine and just making it Yveltal instead. And when it's a big tournament that's going to be 9 rounds day 1, 5 day 2, you just want to be consistent. And when one Ultra Ball can search out 3 of your main attacker and you're pretty much good to go, that sounds like a pretty good idea. And as you can see, Hex is the other hot tech as well. Unfavourables, again, the Eeveelutions are awkward. They're going to be playing Jolteon sometimes. Even if they're not, like Umbreon, just with so many hammers, is awkward for you. And Espeon is actually really efficient against you because Yveltal naturally has to put a lot of energy onto itself. So that just lends to Espeon's attacks, and it's very awkward for them. So yeah, I found those to be unfavourable. And also Lapras again, just because of the amount of hammers they have. Even if you have non-EX Yveltal to try and Oblivion Wing some energy back, that's only going to stall them really for a few turns until the Lapras KOs it, and then you're back to square one. So yeah, Yveltal Garb does have a couple of issue matchups, but overall, I would say it's the deck with plenty of 50-50s. So a good player piloting it, could do well with this deck for sure. In at number 5, we had Quad Lapras. This is the deck that sort of popped up after Malmo with its one top 4 placement from Carl Peters. This is the first person to really pilot the deck to great success. And from there, we've seen it a couple of times in Utah as well. So some other good players picking up and playing it. I know Michael Pramort was one of the ones making top 32 of the list. I think he actually got top 16. So there's something here. I know it's been tearing up League Cups here in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. A few of my Complexity teammates have been doing well. Alex Dow and Benjamin Pham as well. So the deck is showing itself to be a top contender, not just a gimmick. And it has a lot of favourable matchups as well, I think. Just being Warlord with a draw engine is such a powerful prospect right now because so many decks are Elixir reliant themselves and they rely on having lots of energy on the board. The fact that you just get rid of it all the time is really good for you. In terms of unfavourables, I think Gyarados is pretty bad for you because they're naturally playing 4 puzzles, at least 1 special charge, and they can one-hit KO your Laprases. With Professor Kukui, they can get those one-hit KOs, and we can't really deny them in any way either too often, so Gyarados seems like a pretty bad matchup for you. Mega Mewtwo is also one of the harder ones because they have so much burst potential. Even if we put 1 energy on our Laprases, that's 30 damage towards Psychic Infinity. They have sometimes 3, sometimes 4 Mega Turbos they have to get past, so your hammers are not very efficient. And Mewtwo just hits like a truck too often, so sometimes they just find a way to outstrength you, and it can be pretty awkward. So watch out for the Mewtwo. Otherwise, Lapras seems pretty strong for me. My hot tech would be Max Elixir. I know that Carl Peters originally played, I think it was 3 in his list, but from the more recent list that I keep seeing, it's just lots and lots of disruption cards. I think 2 Max Elixir is the sweet spot personally, because it means that against like Volcanium and against Turbo Darkrai, these decks where you do have to get set up as quickly as possible so that you can deal with the non-EX Volks and the non-EX Yveltals and start getting those Ice Beams early and getting Blizzard Burns early, seem important enough for me to play the 2 count. Lapras lists are still getting refined better and better each week, it seems. But I think Elixir is something that people have underestimated in the deck for a few matchups, where I think Volk is one of your harder matchups, awkwardly enough. So Elixir keeps that in the balance and keeps you in the game. I think this is a really strong deck, and it's going to be one... It'll be interesting to see how many people actually pick up and pilot this deck. Depends on how many people have tested it enough. Don't know if it's quite... I know it's fairly popular in Europe now. It's starting to make the rounds and everyone else is seeing lists and stuff and such, but don't know how popular it's actually going to end up being. So it may be one of these that you only need to expect to play against once in day 1, but it's one that you might want to consider yourselves as well. So interesting deck for sure. In at number 4, we do have Mega Mewtwo. I think, again, this is a really strong pick for the tournament. This was actually, when I was pre-making my top 10 list, just in theory, I had Mewtwo as like my 2nd place instead of my 4th, because I was really surprised by its recent performances. Only 2 top 32s in Melbourne, 1 top 4 in Malmo, and only 1 top 32 in Utah. I really thought this deck would be piloted to more success this season. I think the deck has gone in strange directions. People throwing in the Espeon, people sticking with Garbodor, people trying different energy types. I think really Mewtwo has lost its way a little bit, and I think the way that I would play Mewtwo going into Brazil would just be a very simple list. It would be straight Mewtwo with 1 or 2 Wobs and 1 or 2 Hex as well. I think from there you just go consistency. All the spaces being dedicated to, you know, the 1-1 Eeveelution line, the 2-1 Gyarados, sometimes 2-2 Garb. I feel like it really dilutes the deck in terms of its consistency. We're already at stage 1 that needs Spirit Links, so you just need those spaces to be consistency cards, I think. And I think the deck still has a lot of inherent power. You have a really good Volcanium, which is a huge step in the right direction. I think with at least 2 Shrine, you're still okay against Turbo Darkrai. A lot of people debate this, that it's not that strong. I think it's fairly winnable, to be honest. I don't think it's negative. So that's something to bear in mind. It doesn't have too many awkward matchups. I think Mega Gardevoir, of course, is the thing that you try to dodge, and it's the auto loss, but I don't think it'll be that popular. Similarly, I think Eeveelutions won't be a popular deck, but it is one that will ruin you, basically. I think Umbreon is fairly balanced, but the Espeon, of course, will just tear through the Mewtwo players. Overall, for hot techs, I think Wobbuffet is a good one. I think I would play either 1 or 2 Wobs, no more than that. But it is a handy card for sure. It's going to help out. Just be a non-EX in the early game to help you against things like Volk. And of course, Decidueye. You need that so that you can start Spirit Linking your dudes and start getting Mega Turbos and all these other things. You just sit behind it and build your Mewtwo's up for a few turns. VS-Eaker back, things like Lysander. Going to be pretty important for you. And the other hot tech is actually a single copy of Energy Absorption Mewtwo. This is really because of Lapras, my fear of other hammer decks, really. I know a lot of lists aren't playing that many shrines. Some are playing like even as low as 1 or 2. So you may as well just play Energy Absorption, so that when you're up against these hammer lists, you can just sit there and use that for a few turns while they waste their VS Seekers and Flare Grunts, because you know that you can get them back. Even if you don't do it in the early turns, but you do it late game, it can be awkward for those sorts of decks. So it's something to bear in mind and be aware of. If you are playing the shrines anyway, it could just bode well for you. I think it's a decent option for sure. But yeah, I would just play a straight Mewtwo, no Garbodor, no Espeon, just go as consistent as possible. Because on paper, Mewtwo has a lot of good matchups, and it's not one to be slept on, because these recent performances, again, when I was making this list, I was really surprised at how low Mewtwo did, because I think it's a top tier deck right now. I think it really is on par with some of the better decks. I think it has a good Decidueye Plume matchup as well, which is a big swing for me. Having a good Volk and a good Decidueye are like 2 of the most important things going into this tournament, and I think Mewtwo ticks both of those boxes. In at number 3, we do have Volcanium, the deck that's just won the Utah Regional Championships, 3 of them being in top 32. It also got the first place at Melbourne, 1 top 8 and 3 top 32. So that really begs the question, why is this not the top pick right now? Well, it does still have a few awkward matchups. Mega Mewtwo, as I say, is a deck that is, even if it's not really winning much, it's still being played a lot of the time, and it puts a lot of Volcanium players off playing the deck themselves. It's also just a deck that is sort of worried about quite a few matchups out there. Because people are naturally throwing Wobbuffets into their decks and throwing extra Hex Maniacs into the decks to try and cover things like Decidueye, Volcanium sort of gets caught in the crossfire of these ability lock cards. So that's an awkward thing for Volk. That's something in the back of my mind I don't like about the Volcanium deck. But other than that, it is super consistent, very powerful, and again, it just has so much burst potential. Great energy recovery, which is important right now, and just huge damage output. That's a fundamental of Pokemon, really. Just hitting hard wins games, and Volcanium has that going for it. And again, as I alluded to, 1 Ultra Ball gets you Hooper, which gets you your entire board, and being consistent through 9 rounds is very important. So Volk is still going to be a top choice. I think it's definitely okay against Turbo Darkrai. It comes down to how well you can time your replacements of Silent Labs. I think at least 3 Stadium is important. I think 1 of those Stadium could even be Rough Seas. I think Skyfield is still the most important one to play in Volk right now. I'd play a 2 count of Skyfield and probably 1 Rough Seas, but I think it's still worth the tech option, because it can help you out against Decidueye's snipes. It also just helps out in random spots. You're playing Floatstones anyway, so you get around things like Fright Night Yveltal a little bit better. That's less pressure for you. And in other 2-hit KO decks, things like Turbo Darkrai, you can just get those cheeky Roughseas, retreat with a Float Stone, and force them into an awkward spot where they have to Lysandre it the following turn, otherwise it gets back out of range of their next attack. So there are times when Roughseas can be really beneficial for you. Also, having a way to counter your own Skyfield means that you can get rid of your own Shamans and things like that on turns if your opponent is playing Skyfield themselves, whereas otherwise you would not be able to do that. So my other hot tech would be Entei. I've got a suspicion that Rayquaza may come out in force in Sao Paulo. I don't think it'll be a huge deck. I think it'll be still less than like 10%, but I think there's murmurs of it being good, and I think it's important to have the tech Entei. I also just think the card is fine in general. A lot of decks need their bench right now, and being a 2-energy attacker rather than a 3-energy attacker is enough a lot of the time. It can finish off things that have been hit with a power heater early on, or because we have steam ups for the Entei anyway, their bench isn't the only thing dictating our damage, so we can still ramp up quite high with its attack. So I think it's a really good tech. I don't even consider it a tech, to be honest. I put it in every one of my Volk lists because Entei is very, very strong right now. I would even play it over Salamence in my personal opinion, but you can even play Salamence if you're really concerned about Mewtwo, but I think the matchup is already long gone and not worth teching for. I think it's better just to be consistent and swing some other matchups here and there. But yeah, Volk is a very strong play as well. I'm going to have to take a quick swig of water. Normally Jack's here to bounce ideas off and give me a time to breathe. On to our top 2. And in at number 2, it's going to be Turbo Darkrai / Dark Dragons. I've plonked them all together to get the... because really the decks function very similarly. Their win condition is to flood the board of energy. It's just the Turbo Darkrai list is very simple in terms of what it tries to do, whereas the Dragons list is slightly less consistent, but has more flexibility and can cover some different matchups for you. Playing the Salamence does give you a slightly better Volcanium, and playing the Giratina can help against some mega matchups, but more often than not, it's to help out against some DC-reliant decks like Gyarados, Vespiquen, and other ones like that. So even to an extent, it can be really good against Decidueye because they're really reliant on their energies as well. But again, it's the issue of consistency. You're adding slots for these cards, and you're taking out basic darks for specials. That makes your elixirs a little bit worse, a little bit less consistent. You also have a lot of heavy retreat Pokemon in the deck, which is awkward for you as well at times. So these are all things to consider. I still think the deck is really strong. I'm personally a bigger fan of the Turbo Darkrai, just the straight build, because it's so simple and so effective. It does what it wants to do pretty much every game, and it's a deck that snowballs and gets out of control quite quickly for the opponent, no matter what they're playing, because your output just gets too high. Recently, it's been performing fantastically well. In Melbourne, it made 1 top 4, and 7 made up the top 32 decks. In Malmo, it got 2 top 8s. In Utah, it came 2nd. It got a top 4 finish, 2 top 8s, and 7 were in the entire top 32. So you can see it's been consistently performing all over the place for lots of different players. And it's because the deck is simply good. The unfavourable matchups would be Gyarados, which is really fringe right now, and Mega Gardevoir, which is pushing its way out to the fringes as well. So there's not much in the way of Turbo Darkrai, and that's kind of why we're seeing it do so well, because it pretty much has at least a 50-50 against everything. And that's a feature of a deck that you want to see for pretty much everything. You don't have too many space for techs, but I think Olympia is a really important one for both the Dragon and the Turbo Dark builds, because Lapras is trying to Ice Beam you. It's a big part of their win condition, and also Decidueye Plume tries to stall you at times as well. So having Olympia available is going to be important. You could even try out PCL instead, but I'm the bigger fan of Olympia. And again, I would hope that you play double Hex Maniac to help out against the Volk and to help out against Decidueye. It seems like those 2 decks are really big on my mind right now, and that's because I expect to play at least like 2 of each of them day 1. Like, it wouldn't be out of the question to play 2 of each of those decks day 1. So having 2 Hex, I think, is pretty important for that for this tournament. And Turbo Darkrai is one that has the space for double Hex and can start using it even on turn 1. So yeah, it's a really good deck, and it's going to continue to do well. Wouldn't be surprised if this ends up taking gold at some point. And then the number one deck is the Decidueye Vileplume. This is purely based on recent performance. I mean, just it's impossible to discredit this deck. It got second in Melbourne, 1 top 4 placement, 3 were in the top 8, and 10 of the Decidueye Vileplume decks were in the top 32. That's almost that's like 30%. So pretty nuts, really. Yeah, the deck's just damn good. Turn 1, item lock, plus lots of damage is really awkward. And in Malmo, it continued to do well. Got first place, also made top 8. And in Utah, it made top 4, top 8, and 8 were in the top 32. The deck just keeps performing, keeps just getting there. It's just really powerful right now. I do think Volcanium EX plus Rainbow Energy is an avenue that I would consider for sure. As we saw with the Malmo winning list, it played Rainbow Energy plus Jolteon, because Jolteon is so awkward to get around in the first instance. The fact that there's a Vileplume there as well just means that you just win games a lot of the time, because people are out of options against it. And your damage is supplemented by having Feather Arrow in there as well, which is phenomenal for you. My other hot tech in the deck right now is actually Trevenant EX. It really bodes well for your stall approach with the deck. When you develop Vileplume, you Lysander something up, you Trevenant them, and literally their only out is like Olympia from there, because they can't manually retreat, and they can't play their switch, their rope, or whatever else unless they have a Hex at the same time. So Trevenant EX is fantastic for you just simply going, okay, I'll Feather Arrow a bunch to the bench and just poke for 20 in the active. It buys you a lot of turns, and turns is all you really need with Decidueye Vileplume, because that damage adds up very, very quickly for you. And it gives you time to develop more energy attachments, which the deck is quite slow to do. And it just lets you build the board really strong. So Trevenant EX is also one that I would consider, because I think it's really strong. The unfavourables, Volcanium, of course, is not very good for you. I don't think it's an auto loss. I think it's like 70-30. Vileplume Decidueye can still beat that deck, but it's very difficult. And I would say the Eeveelutions is also a very difficult matchup for you. Everything else I think is fair game for Decidueye. It can be it just goes first and stops people developing in the first place. And that alone is enough a lot of the time to just win games. So Decidueye Plume has to be my number one pick, because it's still just performed so well in the last few regionals and internationals, despite the fact that we've all known the deck is out there, the deck's a threat, and it still continues to do well. It's still making that top 4, top 8, and 8 in top 32, despite the fact that everyone knew that it was going to be the best deck going into Utah. It still made top 8 of the top 32 placements, so the deck is just bonkers. It's on a really high power level. Even though it has some of these inconsistency issues, even though it has issues with energy denial, like there's blatant issues with the deck, it's just the fact that it can still just power through people. It's incredible how good this is, so it's got to be my number one pick, just based on performance alone. So yeah, watch out for some of these wobs and stuff, but really I wouldn't think that you should tech for it. I think it's more so the case that you have to keep your deck as consistent as possible. Maybe try the Trevi X, maybe try the Jolteon, but they don't take up too many slots. I think Jolteon is literally a 1 count, Trevenant is a 1 count. From there you just have the builds that everyone else has been doing well with. There's plenty that you could net deck and do well with, to be honest. There's so many Decidueye Plumes out there right now. So yeah, the deck is very strong, and that will conclude our top 10. There's also a few other options out there, ones that didn't make the top 10 list, things like Rainbow Force. I think it's really a consistency issue, which is why it's not higher up on the list. Vespiquen, it has an awkward Volk and it has an awkward Decidueye, but it can do quite well against a field of Turbo Dark and other decks like that. Tauros Hammers has been flirted with. It's made a couple of placements in the top 32 recently. Houndoom Bunnelby was a deck that we saw in Sheffield do quite well, and has not really kicked on from there, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. And Lycanroc as well has been flirted with recently, just because it can do well against Turbo Darkrai and sort of tries to figure out the other matchups as it goes, just with energy denial and such. Even Groudon's been something that I should have put a picture of it, because that's a Dark Knight in the format right now that a few people are testing out and just hoping they lead Wobbuffet, basically, and try and build a deck around leading Wob. So yeah, plenty of other options out there. If I've still not listed one of your favourite decks, please put it in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear from you guys. I really hope you enjoyed this top 10 list. It's a shame that Jack wasn't here for it, but it's because he's on holiday. So next time you'll have some more than just my own opinion in this video. But again, I hope you did enjoy. 10 very good decks and plenty other potential options. It's going to be exciting to see what actually does well, what people bring to the tables, in what percentages, and at the end of the day, how well I do, because that will be pretty important as well. So please leave a like to this video if you did. It did take a while to make. And obviously, if you've been sat here for this long, I imagine there was something that you enjoyed. And yeah, subscribe to the channel if not already. For now though, it has been Joe from Omnipoke, and I'll be seeing you guys in Brazil.